The doll turned, looking widely at her, smile painted on. The red lips opened, and the doll quacked outrageously, a flat, slapping voice coming out of that fair mouth. "Go away, old lady," the doll said. "Go away, old lady. Go away." This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 20 in season 3, and we are finishing our series on creepy children. All right, so I actually paused there a moment before I said this is the No Fear Cast because I was just so terrified by that intro that you read, Lisa. It was very effective.
Well, a funny story. So for our listeners out there, we record this podcast over Skype because we all live separately from each other. And I knew we were going to be talking about Shirley Jackson's The Bus, and which is where the opening quote is from. And it's been a while since I read that story. And so I was rereading it in preparation for this, and I had just gotten to that line when Skype rang in on my computer, and I must have jumped a mile when that happened, because that's a scary line. I mean, it's a spooky story anyway, and Shirley Jackson knows how to write that kind of, where it, I don't know. She knows how to write terror really well and frighten people, but that line in particular is a scary one.
That whole story from beginning to end is just so atmospheric and so creepy. I mean, listeners, in this episode, we're going to be talking about some childhood horror that's adjacent to the creepy children. So objects or things associated with children. And when we first started talking about doing this topic, the first thing probably that popped in my mind was the Living Doll episode on the Twilight Zone, which I'm sure we'll probably mention. But the second thing was Shirley Jackson's The Bus, because that scene, and we're going to talk about the story, but that scene where the woman faces her toys from childhood and they all start moving and talking to her, and she beats it out of that house. I would be right behind her. Ever since I was a little kid, I've been creeped out by dolls in particular. So yeah, a doll talking to someone, that to me is the perfect kind of uncanny terror. And there's so much that's uncanny and weird and scary in The Bus that it's it just keeps building and building and building until you get to that moment. And then that just crazy Twilight Zone ending, which is so good.
Oh, it does read a lot like a Twilight Zone episode. In reading this, okay. So Mel, you mentioned we are going to be talking about kind of objects associated with childhood. And this is, I guess, the third episode we've been in this series. We've been discussing creepy children, and we've spent a couple of episodes talking about why children are creepy or when children turn monstrous, and how a lot of horror hinges on that. But we wanted to talk specifically about kind of just that realm of childhood that a lot of horror exists in. And of course, Shirley Jackson's playing this up by talking about the toys, because not only, and I had forgotten, I remembered the doll from this story, but I had forgotten that before the doll even starts talking, there's a wooden snake that starts slithering around. Which is terrifying. And there's also a toy clown that, listen to this. She says she sees the toy clown, not only just sees it, she sees it in the back of a closet, which was my fear as a child, of things coming out from the back of the closet. But it's this toy clown that's sitting in the back of the closet, and it's described as flopping languidly forward and back. While it's coming alive, also with this kind of bright and cheerful look on its face, which that image right there, I don't know, something about that word flopped forward and back, that phrase just adds to it, because that's scary.
Yeah, there's so much wrong with this.
I mean, but it's all your childhood nightmares kind of come to life. And when you really think about it, there's a lot of, I guess, what we would consider kind of classic horror stories that are built upon these childhood fears of like things under the bed or things coming out of the closet or some inanimate object coming to life. I just watched recently the new trailer for the second part of It, and which, by the way, that looks so good, and I just cannot say how excited I am about that. Like, I can barely form words because I'm just like, Bill Hader, Bill Hader, Bill Hader. It looks good, but that's a perfect example of, of course, in that story in Stephen King's It, Pennywise is like this kind of ancient demon-like thing that haunts the town. But so much of that is built in these kind of childhood objects that take on a sinister nature, like a red balloon floating, right? Or a clown, or even the opening scene of that book with the little toy boat kind of going down in a rain drain. And that seems to be, this is Shirley Jackson's The Bus. It exists in the same realm as something like Stephen King's It. It plays upon those same fears.
Oh, yeah. And I think in some ways it also plays with how can I word this? Like how our childhood fears stick with us, thinking about the Jackson story, because you have this older woman, Miss Harper, who's in this house that's not her house, but she says it's like the one she grew up in. And it's almost like she's going back into childhood and reliving something, or has this part of her childhood in her somehow as memory. And, it's stuff is happening in the closet. There's noise in the closet. You're like, don't go in the closet, Harper. And she goes in the closet. She opens the closet and she's like happy at first. She almost is like a child again because she's seeing her toys become animated. And unlike you and me, Lisa, this doesn't terrify her. She's like, yay, this is great. It's almost like she's going back to childhood, but there's a darkness there that I think you're pointing out. And when the toys don't recognize her and when they like jeer at her and yell at her and call her an old lady, there's this idea of like, I don't know, there's like a tension in her. Like she remembers her childhood and there's some sort of connection to it because in the end she's screaming for her mother. But at the same time, she's facing the reality of like who she is, that she's lonely, that she's older, that she's far away from that. And so I think there's something that these writers are doing with like the fears that we have as children, but how they can pursue us as we get older, and then how they may change as the idea of getting older becomes something that we're trying to become accustomed to. So, I mean, I don't know, that may not have been as specific as I wanted it to be, but I think there's like a tension there of like facing something from childhood and then it turning on you or realizing that it could be a fearful thing. That's coming through all of these.
Right. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. Because before I went on my long rant about It and Bill Hader, which again, I don't apologize for.
You don't need to. No.
I'm very excited. But you said that it is kind of the uncanniness that's happening in this scene. And we've talked about, like dolls and robots and children to some degree kind of fit this uncanny valley. And we've talked about it over many episodes. So, but for me, like, and I think this is what you're saying is that the tension and the uncanniness isn't necessarily that this doll is talking, but what really drives that nail in of the terror and the horror of what's happening in this moment, which again just shows how I think talented Shirley Jackson was, is when the doll, not when the doll speaks, but when the doll says, "Go away, old lady."
Mm-hmm.
Because like you said, it takes these childhood fears, but childhood fears, and this is something again that writers later like Stephen King would do, because it's never just a child experiencing these childhood fears. It's usually an adult reliving them. And I think the tension there is almost akin to like and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but this is kind of what I see is it almost an existential terror that's at the heart of these stories, because I think it's only when you look back at childhood that you do realize how much time has passed, and the fact that her toys don't recognize her. And she immediately starts screaming, "Mommy, mommy, mommy," but the idea there is that there's no mother there for her.
Mm-hmm.
That she is alone, and that it's just, in fact, it says as she's screaming this, she's going down into darkness. Those are the words in the story, is that she goes down into darkness and she's trying to catch onto something solid and real. And I think that is real. And it is, I don't know, maybe I'm not quite hitting the nail on the head, but I don't know. To me, it is almost this something that is very close to existential dread. Of realizing that you're getting older, that there is kind of a terror in knowing that you're alone and that you are the adult. Because when you're a child, there's going to be people to take care of me. And when you're an adult, you lose that sense of safety. And I think that just in those few, I mean, really, it's probably 10 sentences, this little section that we're talking about of the story. But she packs so much into just those few sentences.
Oh, yeah. And, when you think about it, and I actually feel like, I probably shouldn't even say this because I don't remember. It's like saying, I read something somewhere. But I remember I read an article in the last few weeks about like childhood, issues or trauma or experiences lasting with us. Like, a lot of times our fears that we have as children don't necessarily go away just because we grow up, right? I mean, like we grow up and we're living a different life and we're doing different things. But I think those primal is probably too strong a word, but those first fears that we had like stick with us. And I think that Jackson is kind of playing on here. Like you said, like she's the adult. She doesn't have her parents to go to. Like she has memories of what it was like to have that, but now she doesn't. She's facing the loneliness and the horror of her life, and the horror of maybe all of our lives, unfortunately. I'm getting pretty dark here. Is that the end of the story just throws her back at the beginning, right? Like she has to keep facing this over and over and over again. So I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something to this idea of like, what we experience as children or those fears we have as children stick with us, whether we consciously remember them or not. We may be an adult and we may be working through them in different ways, but we're still facing those same basic fears of loneliness, of loss, fear of the dark, like loss of control, and fear of not being able to control other things, or fear of the pursuit of something. I don't know, the more we talk in this podcast, the more I think that like the fears we had as kids just keep following us just in different guises. And maybe that's what Shirley Jackson is pointing out here as well.
Yeah, I like that idea of, you mentioned loss of control. And I think a lot of these fears probably share that as a common root. Because of course, after all of this, and you kind of mentioned the end, what does Miss Harper do? But she immediately says that she's going to report the bus driver. And that to me is like a very frightened woman trying to grasp onto any sort of control she can.
Mm-hmm.
When he wakes her up and kind of says, "You have to get off the bus now," and she's like, "I'm going to report you." Like that's almost, in fact, that is the first words. Well, the first words out of her mouth are, "You'll be sorry." And then she says, "I intend to report you." And then I'll certainly report you. So yeah, that is interesting, because it's strange to think that, you know, adult fears feel so different from the fears that you had as a child, but I think at their root cause, they're probably very similar.
Oh yeah, and she even says at one point, oh, like midway through the story when she first shows up at the hotel slash bar or whatever, she says she realizes that like the bus driver, she had to ride the bus because there was no other way to get home from her visit. The bus driver made her get off when she wasn't supposed to. She had to get picked up as a hitchhiker. She had to get dropped off there even though she didn't want to and wanted to go to this other place. And she says at one point, like, in the morning, like, I'll be fresh and I will show them that I can make decisions.
Right.
And, you know, any Jackson fan, that's remind you of every heroine in Jackson books ever.
Very, 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 very much Eleanor as I was reading this. You know, even in the way like she wants. It reminds me so much, oh my gosh, of Eleanor with her sister at the beginning of The Haunting of Hill House.
Yes.
You know, with the I'm going to take the car, you can't take the car, it's my car. You know, they kind of have that kind of back and forth. And the sister comes across really horribly. And it is kind of the same way here because you're right. She's being taken like off. She's being kicked off the bus. And she even talks about how like, you know, her suitcase is being banged around and thrown around and she's upset about that, you know. But yeah, you know, she keeps thinking I'm going to, I don't know. It's almost like she's demanding respect. Or she intends to, if that makes sense, intends to demand respect later. Mm-hmm. But she's a bit indignant at how she's been treated, but she won't speak up. And it's not until closer to the end of the story, after she's kind of relived this and confronted this, that she's able to kind of at least take back a little bit of that control.
Right. Well, and I mean, in The Haunting of Hill House, she even, and this is probably getting slightly off track, so we don't have to pursue this, but Jackson even makes out the people in the house as acting childlike the more scared that they get. The more things that happen that make them lose control or feel that there's something after them, the more childlike they act, to the point where, you know, that Montague even calls them children. And of course, Eleanor's whole imaginary trip to a Hill House, where she's thinking about her childhood and trying to fix the problems that she had, because, you know, the stuff that happened to her when she was a child is the same stuff that she's scared of and dealing with in Hill House, even though she's an adult. I don't know. I'm starting to think Jackson is even more brilliant than I thought she was with like figuring out how we tick and what really, you know, scares us or is a problem for people.
Well, yeah. I mean, and just kind of going back to that idea of, because when you think about fears of childhood, a lot of it is, it does come down to that feeling powerless. You know, I've even been I've mentioned before on this podcast that I have 2 little boys, and my youngest right now, we've had a really hard time with him going to sleep at night. We've always had trouble with that one, going to sleep, but the new thing right now is that he's lonely. You know, he's like, I can't go to sleep because when I'm in my room by myself, I'm lonely. And like, he hasn't quite said it, but you can kind of see in his eyes that there's a little bit of fear with that too. The fear of being alone. Mm-hmm. And when I think back to my childhood, you know, I mentioned like I did not like to look into the closet because I just imagined all sorts of things living back there and that they were going to kind of creep out of the shadows. I was one of these who had to have the door shut all the way to the closet. If it was cracked even a little bit, you know, that was not okay with me. I also didn't like things under the bed, you know. Any place that I thought something could hide and like come out. But it did go to that idea of powerlessness. Like, what would I do? You know, what would I do? I had my plan mapped out in my head. I was like, okay, if something comes out of that closet, I'll run this direction, you know? And I think there's also the fear too. And this kind of goes back to what Jackson is playing on, because a lot of her characters experience that sense of powerlessness, you know, going back to Eleanor and her kind of obsession with childlike things. And of course there's the infamous cup of stars when she stops on her road trip and sees the little girl throwing a fit over her cup of stars. And Eleanor, what does she say? She says, don't let them take it from you. And so there's that idea again of being this kind of powerless child and having the adults just kind of run your life and take things from you and you have no say in it. You know, that's something that when you really think about it, I don't know. Yeah, I can't say much except Jackson was brilliant. I mean, yeah, I'm like you. The more I think about it, I'm just like, and it's all over, you know. Some of my favorite scenes, even going to like Mary Cat, in We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and of course, my favorite scene is that grocery store scene where she imagines all the citizens of the town kind of dead beneath her feet as she's stepping over their corpses to go grocery shopping. But isn't that is a moment of taking back power, because in that moment she feels powerless, she feels helpless, and so in her imagination she's becoming the victor.
Oh yeah, and when you read We Have Always Lived in the Castle, it's hard for me to remember how old Mary Cat actually is, because the way that she thinks and talks and things that she does makes you feel, at least in my mind, that she's a younger character than she is.
Right.
And that's something that Jackson does with a lot of her protagonists to show us that they feel powerless. Like the woman in the bird's nest who, you know, literally has like absolutely no control at the beginning of the book, or well, anywhere in it, but especially at the beginning. Again, it was something that happened to her in childhood. Or even Hangs a Man, where the entire beginning of the book is the girl talking about things that happened to her. She's never actually doing anything. Yeah. And I think you're right that that's something that kids are afraid of, right? Because you don't have control. And that's one of the issues that we worry about with kids is the child having too much control or too much power. You know, that goes to like that Twilight Zone episode we talked about in the first creepy child episode with the kid that runs the town because he can read their thoughts and he wants everybody to be happy. I mean, that's like the extreme of the child that has too much power, on the other side of the child who doesn't have any power, and that's the fear. So I don't know. It's like this kind of working back and forth of that thread, just coming at it from different directions.
Yeah, absolutely.
This wasn't in our notes, and we hadn't even really talked about it, but but while you were talking about kids feeling like they're like losing control and that sort of thing, it made me think of that. It was a book first by Neil Gaiman, but the movie Coraline and all the stuff that we have about kids who find like alternate realities. And it seems like those things play into that idea of the fears of children, either of like your parents not being able to protect you, or like your parents, you know, are not good parents for whatever reason. And you find another place where you have, you know, better parents who pay attention to you and fix the foods that you like. And I have control and I can have whatever toy I want, or I can look this way, or I can do this. And those alternate realities are never good. Because they're not real, you know, and how many of us as kids like thought about running away, and this idea of like, I'm going to go somewhere where like I can do this, this, and this, and people appreciate me, and blah blah blah. That's like a kid thing, right? And
right,
it's when the grass is not necessarily greener on the other side. It can be way more complicated, and I think this kind of like idea of like having control versus a lack of control or too much control it pops up over and over again in this literature.
That, and yeah, the idea of with the control of wanting to fix problems that seem too big, you know, in reality, to kind of go into that imaginative space, I guess.
That it's going to be better there. You know, like I don't have to
Right.
face reality. I can escape into whatever this is. Yeah.
Right. And this may have been because when I was a child, when I was really young, I was absolutely obsessed with the musical Annie, um, which uh, is an odd one to be obsessed with, I guess. But that fueled my wanting to run away.
Mm.
Because I was convinced that like that's what runaways were like, was Little Orphan Annie. And eventually a very wealthy man was going to adopt you and everything was going to be perfect and he was going to put you in a little yellow dress and take you to his mansion. But yeah, there is that kind of childlike idea of like when things don't go right, that that is a certain kind of escapism, or I'm going to fix this kind of perfect life. But the problem with that is when you, like you said, when you really think about it from a child's point of view, okay, yeah, that seems like a perfect fix. As adults, we know that doesn't exist, because when I think back on it now, like I kind of laugh, but I'm like, okay, let's really think about what I was wishing for. I was wishing to become an orphan. That my family would just, I don't know, either disappear or die or I don't know what. It probably didn't help that like I also was a huge Disney kid too, and parents do not fare well in like Disney movies either. But in my mind that was the start of an adventure. And it's really horrific to think about it that way, but like it goes back to that idea of not being able as a kid to not know everything you need to know in order to fully understand the ramifications of these like imaginings. And I'm sure like some therapist would tell me that that's normal and it's all about like gaining independence or whatever, but looking back it's pretty horrific. And you're right that a lot of these kind of stories that deal with children who need to fix their world, it may seem okay for a while, but then it very quickly turns horrific, as with like a Coraline or something like that, or even any of these possessed doll stories. I know you had mentioned like the Twilight Zone earlier, and there was that one, what was it, the living doll you were telling me about?
Oh yeah. The Living Doll was the title of it. And it was, I think it was a season 5. Yeah, it was a season 5 episode. And basically, I mean, I don't know, listeners, if anybody remembers like the Chatty Cathy doll. My mom had one that I then had and played with. So I know what it is. Apparently, I saw online that the woman who did the Chatty Cathy voice also, I think she might have also done the doll's voice in the Twilight Zone episode, which is kind of creepy. But basically, yeah, in the Living Doll, you have this Talkie Tina, which is this doll that talks when you pull on the string. And basically, what's going on is it's an abusive household. So you have a woman and her child, and she's recently married this man who is, I guess they can't have children now. I'm not 100% sure. I actually rewatched the episode a couple weeks ago, but he's angry because he wants children of his own and not like her daughter. So he is not nice to the daughter at all. And so the mom buys the daughter this doll, and the man just hates it because it's an expense and it makes the kid happy, basically. And when he's alone, so he's saying these horrible things to the kid and the mom, and then when he picks up the doll to like play around with it, the doll says different things to him. So, it's like, I'm Talkie Tina, I love you very much, or something like that, but when it's talking to him, it says it doesn't like him, it hates him. And then as the episode goes on, it's threatening to kill him. And so he has this like bizarre conflict going on with his doll where he throws it away. He tries to cut it open with a circular saw, and nothing he does hurts it or, phases it. And no matter what he does, it keeps coming back until it murders him at the end of the episode. But for me, I thought it was kind of interesting that it's not just playing with the uncanny of the creepy doll, but like the doll is actually going after the person who's being mean to the girl who owns her. So it was almost like this strange, like he thinks the girl is actually doing it. It's almost like this revenge against him by the girl, but the girl and the mother don't have anything to do with it. It's just the doll. So, obviously it's disturbing because the doll could turn on anyone and take them out. But I thought it was interesting that it was an abusive parent that doesn't have a good connection with the child, and the doll is kind of trying to protect the child. That seemed like a slightly different twist to me than some of these like possessed dolls, that are in our kind of cultural zeitgeist right now.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too that because it kind of reminded me of almost like a poltergeist type situation where, because a lot of times they'll connect poltergeist to like young or adolescent girls, especially. But yeah, this idea of a not ideal home life and a girl feeling powerless and needing to escape. And whereas you have something like we were just mentioning, Coraline, where you have something where, okay, she has this escape to another family, another world that ends up kind of not being great. Really not being great.
Mm-hmm.
And here you have it's almost a similar situation, except as you said, it's the twist is that the doll is actually kind of standing up for the child. Of course, it's a Twilight Zone episode, so they couldn't really go too deep into it.
Although they only had like 30 minutes.
They had 30 minutes, so it's pretty much what you would think. Stepdad is mean to his stepdaughter. Doll doesn't like it. Doll turns murderous. He tries to kill the doll in many, many ways, and as we know, with murderous dolls, they always come back. Although I did find it interesting that the mom's name in this show, because when you mentioned it to me first, I did not remember seeing this, and I've seen quite a few Twilight Zone episodes. I don't want to say I've seen them all, but I've seen a lot over the years. And for some reason, I had just missed this one. But when I went to look it up, the mom's name is Annabelle.
I just noticed that, yeah.
Yeah, and so this is 1963. And of course, like I knew, like, okay, Talkie Tina, that's Chatty Cathy, because I was like you. I'm pretty sure I played with the Chatty Cathy doll at my grandmother's house. But Annabelle seems to be a really common name for like possessed or murderous dolls. And I don't know what to make of that. This was in 1963. And as I'm sure our listeners know, Annabelle, there was a famous doll that Ed and Lorraine Warren, I'll try not to say that with too much disdain, that they said that she was possessed. I'm not a fan. And I don't know when they said she was, I don't know when that happened, but it's interesting that because Annabelle can't be that much of a common name, can it?
Oh, it would depend on the time period. Maybe.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. The real Annabelle started doing its bad stuff in the 60s, though, didn't it? Or am I wrong about that?
See, I don't know. That's what I wasn't sure if it was the 60s or the 70s.
Of course, the real Annabelle doll is also a Raggedy Ann doll. It's not the portrayal in the movie.
Right. Right. The one that they had is the Raggedy Ann doll, and then it became the creepier. But wasn't the Raggedy Ann's name was Annabelle?
Ooh, I don't know. That'd be interesting.
Um.
Okay, so Raggedy Ann was like short for Annabelle?
Well, no, I mean that was the possessed Raggedy Ann. Like I think
Right,
her
yeah,
name was Annabelle.
the possessed Raggedy Ann was Annabelle, yeah.
But I'm almost positive that happened. I am almost positive that happened in the 70s.
Yeah, I'm thinking it was like 1970 even, or the early 70s. And it had been doing stuff before they got it too. So
that yes. Yes. I'm gonna try. I was gonna try to look up their museum because they had a museum for a while and they were running a website. And I don't know if they still are, but I feel like Annabelle, they got the Raggedy Ann, like the story of the haunting started in the 70s.
yeah, I'm looking at an article that's in Glamour magazine, and they say 1970
Okay.
was when it started doing bad things, like when it was reported
Yes.
as doing bad things. Yeah.
So it might have been around, but anyway, I think we can say that this Twilight Zone, the Living Doll, predates that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying we're debunking them, but
And just don't use Tina or Annabelle for any names, like just to be on the safe side.
yeah.
Tiny Tina did some good, but I don't really. Or Talkie Tina did some good in that episode, but I don't really trust her.
Which just by the way, too. I mean, baby dolls are creepy. I mean, we've talked about them as kind of being uncanny. And I know for the Annabelle movie that they changed her to be this kind of like porcelain doll because that's also a very common when you see creepy dolls, they're usually those porcelain dolls. But Raggedy Ann, she's pretty creepy to me. But I don't know. I feel like we're kind of dancing around the subject, and we've got to bring up Child's Play at least a little bit. Because Chucky, I mean, it's the same thing. It's a child's toy that becomes possessed, right?
By a
Child's
killer,
Play,
right?
right.
Yeah.
If I remember right, oh gosh, it's been forever since I've seen the original. Was it where he was being like transported? Was that one of them, or was that one of the sequels? The killer was being transported in a van, like a police van, and there's like a car wreck and a storm and a lightning strike. And a doll factory was nearby. Or maybe I'm making this up.
In the first one, isn't he running away from the police? In the original Child's Play, he's like running away from them, and they shoot him, and he's in like a toy store or something. This is horrible that we can't remember this.
I don't know. It's oh gosh.
And it's like a My Buddy knockoff, kind of.
It is.
Yeah.
It's definitely a My Buddy. My buddy.
Well, in that
I had a kid sister doll, so.
Oh, see, I didn't have either. They would have creeped me out too much. Am I remembering correctly that that's another one where like the doll is doing bad things and the kid gets blamed? Like that's another issue. That's another childhood fear. Nobody believes you, kind of thing.
I think if it wasn't, see, then this is where because there were so many sequels that it's all kind of running together in my mind. But yeah, if I'm remembering right, okay, I had to look this up. So yeah, there's a serial killer who's being chased by the police, And apparently he breaks into a toy shop, and that's where he's shot by the detective. The detective is following him. He shoots him. But the serial killer, luckily, knows voodoo.
Of course.
And he's able to say a spell, which is then the store is struck by lightning. I remembered lightning somewhere. But he's able to transfer his soul into one of these dolls that's there, which it was called a good guy's doll, but it was very much My Buddy.
Now I can't get that My Buddy song out of my head.
Right? You'll be singing it now. But oh man, I forgot how much voodoo was in this.
Because he tries to use it toward the end, right?
Right.
Because he wants to get into anyone to get out of the doll. And I think he was targeting the kid.
Right, because the mom, it was a single mom too. She purchases the kid as the doll as a birthday gift.
And it was something people wanted, like Cabbage Patch Dolls and Tickle Me Elmo kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, but you're right, because I kind of want to talk about that a little bit, but the idea too of not being believed. And then that goes back to that's kind of an offshoot of the idea of lacking power in your life and the frustration that can come from that. I think especially as a child, but not being believed, or being blamed for something, or witnessing something outlandish and not being believed by a parent, especially by a parent, because I think that feels like the biggest kind of slap in the face when you're a kid, right? Is your parents are the ones who, I mean, really they're the ones who are supposed to know you best, and for them not to believe you, that's big. And I feel like the kid, and he's like a 6-year-old in this movie, but it's not just that like his mom is worried that or doesn't believe him, but isn't he actually like taken to a psychiatric hospital at one point?
So, and of course she starts to believe him toward the end.
Yeah.
But the police and stuff, don't.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I do think that is kind of a childhood fear that something supernatural or not happens to you that you don't have anyone to talk to about it, or someone isn't going to believe you, or they're going to dismiss, they're going to dismiss actual fears. This is just sticky in my mind because I've been watching the Netflix Haunting of Hill House, but the moment of like a parent dismissing, like, oh my gosh, these horrible, like terrifying things I'm seeing, whatever, and just kind of like, well, there's dreams and there's reality, kid. And if you're the audience watching this or reading the book or anything, and a parent starts doing that, you're like, no. Like, believe this child. But I think that's a childhood fear of like your parents are supposed to fix everything and protect you, and if you see something or experience something and you go to them and they don't believe you, that's terrifying.
Well, that is what, yeah, I mean, because that is what they always tell you to do, right? And I mean, that's what I always tell like my kids. Like, I think about what I tell my children, right? And I'm always like, if you are in an unsafe situation or if something happens, you come find mommy or daddy and we will help you. Or, we go through this, like now that my youngest one is starting kindergarten in August. And so he's going to be like spending more time away from me now. So we've had that talk about, okay, well, what happens if, you're on the playground and get hurt and you can't come find mommy? Like, who do you go to? Okay, you go find a teacher. You go, they've got their list of like trusted adults, right? And it's always like, kind of the hierarchy of it. It's like, okay, mommy, daddy, my teachers, policemen or police people, firemen, firewomen. But, you go find those kind of people who are supposed to be the ones you can trust. And it's really interesting when you look at this movie, even just the first Child's Play, that the child, he's not only not believed by his mom, but like the police start questioning him and he's a suspect. And so all of it kind of knocks down one by one all the adults that are supposed to take care of you and the ones who are supposed to be there that you run to, and then what happens when you can't run to them. By the way, in looking up all of this about Child's Play, so of course there's the new one coming out this summer, which I will admit I will probably go see, if nothing else than just for I guess old time's sake. One of the posters they have for the movie, it says Child's Play, June 21st. I guess that's when it's coming out. And you see Chucky's little doll hand, and he's holding a skewer over a fire. And on the skewer is half of Slinky Dog, what looks like Slinky Dog from the Toy Story movies.
Oh, no.
Which, it's kind of, when you think about it, it's like it's kind of funny, but then at the same time, like, you look at the dichotomy of that, of like the Toy Story movies, which is doing all the things that we're talking about in this episode, of like toys coming to life and toys being animated. But those movies are so wonderful. And, it's like all the best parts about childhood wrapped up into, into a movie that makes you have all the warm fuzzies. And then here's the other one. It's like literally skewering it and roasting it over a fire.
Yes, but in Toy Story 3, in the Gang of Bad Toys, there was the big baby. That thing was creepy. And it also reminded me of this baby doll that my sister and I had that was older and kind of like falling apart, and we lost the clothes for it. And if any doll was going to be like the kind of henchman or the heavy for a bad doll gang, it would have been the big baby type doll. The flippy kind of eyes, and the weird, terrible crying sound. And yeah, that was...
Well, even in the first Toy Story, there's the kid who... who will like basically mutilate all the toys. He takes like the Barbie's head and puts it on another toy, or like cuts all the hair off of his sister's dolls. And, that's kind of getting into it when you think about two toys as being a source of horror. Because if you've ever watched a child play with toys for long enough, it will eventually devolve into something really horrific. I mean, they're not always, nice with their toys. I wasn't. I did not play with baby dolls. I thought that they were creepy since I was a tiny child. But I loved like Barbie dolls. But I would do horrible things to my Barbie dolls. I mean, they were constantly being like tied up and kidnapped and threatened with scissors to have their hair like chopped off. I mean, kids are generally not nice when you watch them really start playing. And
that is true.
That may be the true horror of seeing all these toys do murderous things. I know we're running out of time on this episode, and I'm having a lot of fun talking about this. By the way, we didn't mention, but Mel, I know you had mentioned this before we started recording, was the Twilight Zone stopover in A Quiet Town, which kind of plays right into what we were talking about, which is what happens when children control things.
Yes.
But I also just kind of want to give a little shout out to Ruby Jean Jensen, who wrote a lot of those like paperback horror books in like the 70s and 80s. I think she wrote for Zebra for a while. She has a lot of these toy books. In fact, she's got a killer doll in one of them. And it's one of these, dolls, I think, that like blinks its eyes and says mama. You can just know the creepiness. But she also took the kind of child's toy thing, I think, further than almost any other writer, because she had things like killer jump ropes. um which it's kind of funny describing, but she really could do things with some children's toys that are not as expected. I mean, we all know dolls can be creepy. Everybody knows that.
Yeah, your description of the Killer Jump Rope book to me, like, just haunted my dreams. Like, you told me about that right before I went to bed. It was not good.
Yeah, it's one of these things where it's like, if I'm remembering it right, because it's been a while, but like, this girl, like, I think finds her father dead. And he's like, murdered, bleeding out. And then she I think she sees herself like jumping rope off
and singing a creepy song. Yeah.
I mean, it's really kind of, one of those like, oh my gosh. We took something that sounded kind of silly and laughable to just really terrifying territory real quick. But yeah, I mean, even, you said like, yeah, she's kind of humming a creepy song, but how many horror movie trailers do we know that will use like a children's song, but just maybe slow down just enough, to make
minor key.
Right. Yeah. Slightly minor key. Yeah. I don't know. There's a lot there. I'm sure we will at some point swing back to this idea of creepy children, murderous children, everything wrong with toys that children play with, or songs that they sing, or games that they play. But I don't know. I think for now we've done well. If nothing else, I hope our readers will go and read or reread Shirley Jackson's The Bus, because that's a fantastic little story.
Oh, yeah. And watch some Twilight Zone episodes.
Always. That's always a good recommendation. Well, we are so glad that you joined us as we finished up our discussion on creepy children. We hope you enjoyed it. We are on the internet, on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Come find us. We'd love to hear from people. We have a website. We have an email address, nofearcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear about your creepy childhood fears, or maybe something that you were thinking about that we didn't get to talk about this time around. But yeah, we would love to hear from you guys, and we will be back in a couple of weeks with a brand new series that we're excited about. And until then, thank you for listening.